What if the most terrifying thing the Vikings ever carried into battle was not their rage, but their patience? Before the screams, before the clash of shields, before iron met bone, there was silence. A cold, deliberate silence that settled over the land like a held breath. The Norse warriors did not rush toward death blindly. They walked toward it with purpose, armed not just with weapons, but with an understanding of fear, how to create it, stretch it, and finally release it in one catastrophic moment. To face a Viking was not merely to fight a man. It was to confront an arsenal designed to unmake you, piece by piece, hope first, body second. This is not a tale of legends polished by time. This is the story of tools built for killing, objects shaped by hunger, desperation, and a brutal understanding of human anatomy. Each weapon carried a role, a message, a promise of what would happen if you stood your ground. And the promise was always kept. The Vikings lived in a world that demanded violence. Harsh winters, unforgiving land, and rival clans forged a culture where survival depended on strength and strategy. A farmer in summer could become a killer in autumn. A sailor one week could be a raider the next. Their weapons were not ceremonial. They were extensions of daily life, refined through generations of bloodshed. Every notch in the wood, every curve in the blade, every ounce of weight had been tested against flesh. Fear traveled faster than the ships. Long before a Viking longship appeared on the horizon, stories arrived first. Whispers spread through villages of men who fought like beasts, who laughed as they killed, who worshipped gods that promised glory through death. But the truth was more unsettling than the myth. Vikings understood that terror was a weapon, and they wielded it expertly. Their arms were chosen not only to kill, but to be seen killing. The right weapon, used the right way, could break an army without destroying it. At the heart of this terror was the most misunderstood symbol of Viking warfare: the axe. To modern eyes, the Viking axe seems crude. A simple blade on a wooden haft. A tool for chopping wood, splitting logs, clearing land. But in the hands of a Norse warrior, the axe became something else entirely: a precise, devastating instrument of death that turned simplicity into savagery. It was not the sword that dominated the battlefield. It was the axe that ruled it. The Viking axe was light where it needed to be, heavy where it mattered. Its blade was thin but wide, designed to bite deep with terrifying efficiency. When it struck, it did not merely cut, it tore. Flesh parted. Bone cracked. Shields shattered. And unlike a sword, which demanded years of training and wealth, the axe belonged to everyone. Farmers, fishermen, raiders, all could wield it. This made the Viking army unpredictable. Any man could be lethal. But the true horror of the axe lay in how it was used. Viking warriors aimed low. A single swing could cripple a leg, dropping an opponent instantly. Once down, mercy was not expected. Another blow followed, precise and final. Axes hooked shields away, dragged defenses aside, and exposed throats and faces. In tight formations, axes worked like keys, unlocking the enemy lines so chaos could flood in. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse, measured not in victories, but in broken bodies. And there was a particular axe that inspired dread above all others. Larger. Longer. Two-handed. The Dain axe. When a Viking carried this weapon, it meant one thing: devastation was coming. The Dain axe demanded space, and the Vikings created that space by force. Its long shaft allowed warriors to strike from beyond the reach of swords, delivering crushing blows that could split shields and skulls in a single motion. Against armored opponents, the weight of the blade transferred force deep into the body, collapsing ribs and pulping organs even when armor held. Men learned to recognize it from afar. The wide blade flashing in the cold light. The deliberate stance of the warrior who carried it. When the Dain axe rose, it was already too late. One swing could end a life, two could clear a path. Entire shield walls broke when these axes began to fall, each impact echoing like a drum beat of doom. Yet the axe was not just a weapon of brute force. It was a psychological instrument. Vikings decorated their axe heads, carved runes into the wood, wrapped handles in leather darkened by sweat and blood. Every detail told a story. This was a weapon that had tasted death before and hungered for it again. Survivors spoke of the sound. Not the scream. Not the clash. The wet, final sound of iron biting into flesh. That sound stayed with them long after the battle ended. It followed them into sleep. It haunted their waking hours. And that was exactly the point. Vikings wanted survivors. Fear spread faster than fire, and a village that surrendered without a fight was easier to plunder than one that resisted. The axe taught a brutal lesson: resistance had a cost. But even as deadly as it was, the axe was only the beginning. It was the gateway weapon, the first taste of what the Norse arsenal could do. Because the Vikings did not rely on a single tool of death. They carried many. Each served a purpose. Each answered a different question on the battlefield. How do you break a shield wall? How do you kill a man in armor? How do you execute someone without wasting strength? How do you terrify those who remain? Every weapon had an answer. And every answer was written in blood. As the Viking stepped forward, axe dripping, breath steady, eyes cold, one truth became clear to those who faced him: this was not chaos. This was design. This was an arsenal refined by centuries of violence, perfected by men who understood that war was not won by courage alone but by choosing the right way to end a life. And the axe, humble and horrifying, was only the first lesson. Because if this was how the Vikings began a battle, what horrors did they save for later? What kind of weapon does not merely belong to a warrior, but defines whether he is worthy to live? If the axe was the weapon of the many, then the sword was the weapon of the chosen. On the Viking battlefield, a sword was never just steel. It was a declaration. To carry one was to announce status, history, and reputation before a single blow was struck. Swords were rare. They were expensive. They demanded skill to use and even greater discipline to maintain. And because of that, every sword carried into battle already had a story, sometimes longer than the life of the man holding it. Most Viking swords were not forged in the north. They came from far-away Frankish lands, workshops where steel was folded, reforged, and marked with signatures that outlived kingdoms. These blades traveled through trade, plunder, and inheritance. A sword might pass through generations, each owner adding blood to its legacy. When a Viking gripped a sword, he was gripping the weight of every life it had already taken. And the enemy could see it. The sword's double-edged blade gleamed differently than the axe. Longer. Straighter. More deliberate. It was not built for wild swings or reckless fury. It was built for control. Precision. Finality. A Viking swordsman did not need to hack. He needed only one opening. The sword punished mistakes. A shield raised too high. A step taken too late. A moment of hesitation. That moment was enough. Unlike the axe, which tore and crushed, the sword cut clean. Its edge slid between ribs, across throats, through joints where armor was weakest. It did not waste energy. It conserved it. In the hands of a trained warrior, the sword moved like a living thing, thrusting, slicing, withdrawing before the enemy could respond. But the true terror of the Viking sword was not how it killed. It was how it waited. Swords demanded restraint. Vikings who carried them learned patience the hard way. Swing too hard and the blade could lodge in bone. Strike at the wrong angle and the edge could chip. A sword taught its wielder to think ahead, to read movement, to predict fear before it showed on a face. This is where the myth of the berserker begins to fracture. Yes, Vikings could be ferocious. Yes, they could fight with animal intensity. But the men who carried swords were often the calmest on the field. While chaos erupted around them, they moved with chilling focus. Every strike measured. Every step calculated. They were not chasing death. They were delivering it. Many Viking swords bore names. Not given lightly. Earned. A named sword was believed to carry a spirit and essence shaped by its past. Some were said to bring victory. Others were cursed, demanding blood in return for loyalty. Warriors spoke to their swords. Cleaned them like sacred objects. Slept beside them. When a sword broke, it was not simply discarded. It was mourned. Because a broken sword was seen as a judgment. If a blade shattered in battle, it was a sign the gods had turned away. And yet, Viking swords rarely failed. Their construction was brutal in its intelligence. Pattern-welded cores gave flexibility. Hardened edges delivered lethal sharpness. Even when nicked and scarred, these blades continued to kill. They were designed not for beauty, but for endurance. A Viking sword could survive dozens of battles, absorbing the violence of an age that never rested. To face a sword-wielding Viking was to face inevitability. Axes could be blocked. Spears could be avoided. But a sword closed distance relentlessly. Shield met shield. Breath met breath. And then, in the cramped, desperate space between bodies, the sword did its work. Quietly. Efficiently. There were no wide swings. No wasted motion. Just a flash of steel, a sudden warmth, and then the cold realization that something inside had been cut that could never be repaired. Stories spread of Viking champions who carved through enemies like shadows, leaving bodies standing for seconds before they collapsed. Men who struck so fast the pain arrived after death. Men whose swords never seemed to dull, no matter how many lives they took. These stories were not exaggerations. They were warnings. Villages that saw a sword among the raiders knew negotiation had ended. A sword meant leadership. It meant experience. It meant that someone on that ship had survived too many battles to count and learned from every single one. And yet, the sword was still not the most personal Viking weapon. Because while the sword defined status, there was another blade that defined intimacy. A weapon used when shields broke, formations collapsed, and combat turned into something closer to execution than war. A blade meant for the final moments. Short. Simple. Unforgiving. The kind of weapon that required you to look into a man's eyes before you killed him. And when the Viking reached for it, the battle was already over. What weapon is so close, so personal, that survival depends on how steady your hands remain when death is only inches away? When the battlefield collapsed into chaos, when shields splintered, axes stuck in bone, and swords were lost in the crush, there was one weapon every Viking still had. The knife. Small enough to be overlooked. Simple enough to be underestimated. And deadly enough to decide who lived and who died when nothing else mattered anymore. The Viking axe was not a backup weapon. It was a promise. Every Norse warrior carried one. Rich or poor. Raider or farmer. Young or old. It hung at the hip, rested against the thigh, or lay hidden beneath layers of wool and leather. Unlike swords, which symbolized status, or axes, which symbolized power, the axe symbolized inevitability. No matter how a fight began, it always ended here. Up close. Breath against breath. Heartbeats pounding in the ears. The axe was a single-edged blade, thick-backed and brutally strong. It did not need finesse. It did not need momentum. It needed only proximity. When the knife came into play, armor no longer mattered. Shields were useless. Training meant nothing if panic took over. This was killing at arm's length. The Vikings knew exactly how to use it. They targeted the soft places. The gaps beneath the helmet. The space between collarbone and shoulder. The inside of the thigh. The knife slipped where larger weapons could not, puncturing arteries, collapsing lungs, ending resistance in seconds. There was no grand motion. No dramatic swing. Just a push. And then the warmth. The axe was also the weapon of silence. In raids, it ended lives without alarm. A hand clamped over a mouth, a blade drawn across a throat, and the night remained undisturbed. Entire households could be neutralized before anyone outside realized what had happened. This efficiency turned Viking raids into nightmares, swift, quiet, and merciless. Those who survived spoke of the aise. Vikings did not look away when they used the knife. They watched life leave the body. Not out of cruelty, but certainty. The job was not finished until the body stopped moving. Until resistance was impossible. Until survival was no longer an option. There was no room for hesitation. The knife demanded commitment. Many axes were beautifully decorated, their handles carved with beasts, runes, and symbols of protection. But beauty was never the point. These knives were work tools in peace and execution tools in war. They butchered animals, cut rope, prepared food. And when the time came, they butchered men with the same cold efficiency. This blurred line between daily life and death was part of what made Viking warfare so terrifying. Killing was not a separate skill. It was an extension of survival. The same hands that fed a family could end another without pause. In duels, the knife often decided the outcome. Two warriors might clash with swords or axes, exchanging blows until exhaustion slowed them both. Then a stumble, a slip, a fall. And suddenly, the fight was no longer about strength or reach. It was about will. About who could move faster in the dirt, who could draw steel first, who could force the blade into flesh before the other did the same. There were no second chances. The axe did not wound. It ended. Viking law even recognized its finality. Certain executions were carried out with knives to ensure death was personal, unavoidable, and absolute. To be killed by the axe was to be denied distance, denied dignity, denied escape. And that was intentional. Because Vikings believed death mattered. How you died mattered. A clean kill was respected. A failed one was shameful. The knife ensured there was no ambiguity. When the axe appeared, the message was clear: this fight would not continue. It would conclude. Yet even this intimate, final weapon was not the most feared on the battlefield. Because while the knife ended individuals, the Vikings also wielded a weapon designed to dominate space itself, to kill before an enemy could even reach striking distance. A weapon that turned the battlefield into a killing field. Long, relentless, unforgiving. The kind of weapon that punished hesitation with instant death. And once it was leveled, there was nowhere left to run. What if the deadliest moment of a battle happened before swords ever crossed, before the enemy even realized the fight had begun? Before the roar. Before the charge. Before the blood soaked into the earth. There was the spear. The spear was the oldest weapon the Vikings carried and the one that killed the most. Simple in form, devastating in function, it turned distance itself into a weapon. When a Viking army advanced, the first deaths did not come from axes or swords. They came from spears flying through the air or thrusting forward in perfect, merciless rhythm. To the Norse, the spear was sacred. It belonged to Odin. The god of war, wisdom, and death carried a spear that never missed its mark. Vikings believed that every spear thrown in battle carried a fragment of that divine will. To be struck by one was not just bad luck, it was fate. And fate did not negotiate. Viking spears varied in length and design, but all shared one purpose: control. Long shafts kept enemies at bay. Narrow, leaf-shaped heads punched through flesh with terrifying ease. Some were built for throwing, others for thrusting, many for both. A warrior could kill from a distance, then close in without ever changing weapons. This versatility made the spear unstoppable. In the first moments of combat, Vikings hurled their spears to break formations. A shield raised to block one left another man exposed. A warrior struck in the chest fell backward, disrupting those behind him. Panic spread instantly. Lines broke. Orders vanished into screams. Then the spears came again, this time held firmly in both hands. Against shield walls, Vikings used spears like levers. They jabbed low at legs and feet, forcing enemies to shift their stance. The moment balance was lost, axes and swords finished the job. The spear did not always kill. Often, it simply decided who would. But when it did kill, it did so with ruthless efficiency. A thrust to the throat. A puncture beneath the ribs. A blade driven into the eye socket. The spear did not need force. It needed accuracy. A trained Viking could deliver rapid, repeated strikes without exposing himself, retreating behind the safety of the shaft before a counterattack could land. Against such discipline, reckless bravery was useless. Cavalry feared the spear most. Horses impaled themselves on raised points. Riders were dragged down, crushed beneath their mounts, finished in the dirt. Entire charges collapsed when spears held their ground. The battlefield became a trap, one the Vikings had prepared for long before the enemy arrived. And then there were the barbed spears. Designed not to kill instantly, but to destroy. Once embedded in flesh, they could not be pulled free without tearing muscle and organs apart. Wounded men screamed, collapsed, and begged for mercy. Their cries shattered morale. Their suffering served a purpose. Fear is contagious. Some Vikings deliberately left wounded enemies alive, knowing they would drain resources, slow retreats, and poison the spirit of those still fighting. The spear made this cruelty effortless. But perhaps the most chilling use of the spear was ritual. Before battle, Vikings sometimes threw a spear over the enemy line, dedicating the coming slaughter to Odin. It was a symbolic act and a deadly one. That first throw marked the beginning of death. From that moment on, no life was spared by chance. The spear chose its victims early. Once the fight was fully engaged, spears turned the battlefield into a forest of death. Movement became dangerous. A single misstep could mean impalement. The ground grew slick. Bodies piled up, creating obstacles that slowed escape and accelerated slaughter. And still, the spears kept coming. Long after arms grew tired, after axes chipped and swords dulled, the spear remained effective. It required less strength, less space, less recovery. It was tireless. Like the war god it served. Yet for all its reach and power, the spear was still only one layer of the Viking arsenal. It dominated the opening moments of battle. It controlled distance. It decided who fell first. But as chaos deepened and formations dissolved, another weapon emerged, one designed not for control, but for destruction. A weapon that turned shields into liabilities and bodies into debris. Heavy. Crushing. Relentless. A weapon that did not cut. It obliterated. And when the Vikings raised it, even the bravest warriors understood one truth. This battle was about to become unbearable.